Die sich um ein Thema dreht, was, wie ich finde, viel zu wenig beleuchtet wird. Dekolonisierung ist ein Thema, was zum Glück mehr und mehr beleuchtet wird und mit dem sich auch vor allem dieses Haus gut auskennt, aber auch das Fluctoplasma Festival als solches. Aber Dekolonisierung im historischen Kontext der Ukraine, das ist tatsächlich, finde ich, noch ein sehr wenig besprochenes Thema und darum soll es jetzt hier gehen. Und wir freuen uns sehr auf diese Runde, die jetzt kommt. Und wir freuen uns auch, dass wir als Dolmetscherin Dr. Kateryna Rietz-Rakul gewonnen haben. Sie ist Dolmetscherin, Übersetzerin, Autorin, Kuratorin und Kulturmanagerin in Berlin und hat den KUL'TURA e.V. mitgegründet, der die internationale Zusammenarbeit zwischen Kreativen aus der Ukraine und anderen Ländern fördert. Und bevor Kateryna jetzt hier die Runde vorstellt, die Personen, die gleich sprechen werden, noch ein paar Sätze von Nina Reibrich.
Vielen Dank, liebe Siri. Genau, wow, jetzt wo schnell geht ein Tag rum, unser erster Tag der Konferenz Tilting Structure. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ein paar es auch noch hierher gefunden haben und auch, wie wir wissen, ein paar im Livestream dabei sind. Ich will gar nicht so viel jetzt sagen, das verspreche ich, aber ich wollte einmal ein paar Worte vorab sagen, weil ich mich auch leider dann in 10 Minuten verabschieden muss. Das ist das Los einer Festivalleitung, die sich nicht entscheiden kann und zu viele Programmpunkte kuratiert. Aber wir freuen uns wirklich sehr, dass wir dieses Panel in diesem Jahr hier gemeinsam mit Anja Dunkel und dem Ukrainischen Institut organisieren durften. Wir sind ein Festival, was 2020 gestartet ist, zu der Hochzeit der Black Lives Matter Bewegung, und wir waren auch im Ganzen als Festival eigentlich so eine Art sichtbares Zeugnis einer überzeugten antirassistischen Repräsentationspolitik, vor allen Dingen im kulturellen Feld. Wie viele zu dieser Zeit, also so 2020 rum, sind wir gestartet mit einem aus den USA importierten Vokabular, BIPOC, Race, Kategorien, die vielleicht im europäischen Kontext manchmal gar nicht so 1:1 zu übertragen sind. Und im vergangenen Jahr haben wir uns dann bereits mit der Konferenz Diversity Check Ost-West auf den Weg gemacht, Begriffe wie BIPOC oder auch Kolonialismus nach einem europäischen Update hin zu überprüfen. So zum Beispiel auch mit einer Keynote von Joanna Wascher, der Stadtkuratorin, mit der wir auch morgen wieder gemeinsam eine Ausstellung eröffnen dürfen, die im Kontext von Polen, Deutschland, Ost-Westeuropa über den Begriff des Kolonialismus bereits gesprochen hatte. Und umso mehr freuen wir uns, dass wir jetzt mit dem Ukrainischen Institut in Berlin und mit unseren tollen PanelistInnen heute dieses Thema fortführen können. Ein Festival der Diversität, was versucht auch wirklich sich selbst zu hinterfragen und auch Begriffe neu zu denken und zu überlegen, wer ist hier eigentlich mit gemeint, mit erzählt worden und wer nicht, und wie müssen wir Begriffe dahingehend überprüfen. Und deswegen möchten wir uns ganz herzlich bedanken für diese Kooperation, für die Zusammenarbeit und die tolle Initiative von Anja Dunkel vor allen Dingen in erster Linie. Und mit diesen Worten möchte ich auch schon übergeben an Maksym für eine erste Lecture-Performance, bevor es ins Panel geht. Vielen Dank und viel Spaß.
It pains me to admit that I had internalized the contempt for Kazakh language and culture baked into the Russian colonial gaze. As a thoroughly Russified Kazakh kid growing up in the 1980s Almaty, I looked down on Kazakhs with less than perfect Russian. Uncultured, I thought, uncivilized, rural. The fact that my own connection to the language and culture of my ancestors had been lost never bothered me. The more distance I could put between myself and all things Kazakh, the better. It seems that Moscow's colonization of Central Asia extended beyond political and economic control or even erasure of language and culture. I didn't just lose Kazakh language and culture, I learned to feel contempt for them, to be embarrassed by them.
Actually, I don't remember the first time when I realized that. that many Ukrainian artists considered Russian in the museums and in the art history, but probably it started with Malevich. I think I was 18 years old when I realized he was from Ukraine and he was connected to Ukraine. I knew, a lot about Ukrainian art, especially avant-garde, that, of course, many people know just as Russian. And I knew almost nothing about Ukrainian art because these books and information and everything from the school, even in the university, everywhere, it was just about Russian avant-garde, how great Russian avant-garde is, how great Russian culture is. But it's like I should prove that Ukraine exists and Ukrainian culture exists, and I should prove that I exist. But if scholars know about British colonialism or French or stolen artifacts from indigenous people in the United States, for example, conversation about Russian imperialism started just now. And we should understand why actually we don't know many names of Ukrainian artists.
I've been raised in a Russian culture. So the only reason I understand it so well, I went to a Russian colonial school. I've been in mostly kind of Russian environment. My grandmother grew up in a Russian orphanage after her family died in famine. My mother grew up in a very Russified environment. In many ways, we felt more Russian than Kazakh. But with the full-scale invasion, I feel that what I miss is that I don't see people of kind of who associate or who identify themselves as Russian joining us in our struggle for decolonization. I feel that a lot of people, one of the ways to physically experience imperial innocence is silence, and to say, it's nothing about me, it's Putin, it's all others. I will just, sit through silently through this war, and then just people will forget and will return to the status quo. And that also is an expression of Russian imperial innocence, because I think you can overcome this innocence by joining us. And this is what I was dreaming of since 2022, and it's something that didn't really happen yet. I wonder how many years will pass when we will have the departure from innocence to activists, to people who actually say, okay, let's end this innocence, let's educate people, let's change the narrative, let's do something about it, let's get into the dialogue. And I think this kind of being silent, just disappearing, is also an expression of Russian imperial innocence.
For centuries, Russia has hidden its dark, imperialistic side behind a facade of romantic myths. Myths that paint it as a victim, a liberator, even a misunderstood missionary. But what if the truth is actually way more simpler? Hey there, I'm Maksym Eristavi, a Ukrainian Czech journalist and author of the award-winning Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. In it, I list 48 Russian invasions of their neighbors in just last 111 years alone. Despite targeting very different and distant communities, Russians would follow the same formula: gaslight, invade, exterminate. And Russian civilizational greatness has been and still is the excuse to colonize. The stories you heard opening this lecture are coming from audio shows we produced by the Volya Hub. It's our pioneering storytelling movement. It's a global push to help communities shaped by Russian colonialism reclaim their stories. Think journalism meets education, meets audience science, meets art, all aimed at busting imperial myths. And the Hub fuels podcasts, books, video explainers, and newsletters. Its flagship social media campaign, Russian Colonialism, has racked up over 350 million views. And I thought tonight I want to share with you a story that is especially close to my heart and my mind. So sometimes before the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine, I visited one of the modern European art museums here. It featured Russian avant-garde paintings. They were all impressive and cool, but this one absolutely paralyzed me. As you see here, it centers this geometrically shaped human figure running along a desert-like space, and the soil under them is colored red and black. And if you can also see in the back, there's a damaged cross and a blood-soaked sword hanging over the lone sack. And these visuals did not absolutely make any logical sense to me at the time, but in their totality, they triggered this overpowering, primal even like reaction. It was a mix of existential pain and terror and grief. I was absolutely surprised. That was the first and honestly the only painting in my life that made me cry. So I checked the name and the author. It's The Running Man by Kazimir Malevich. Nationality, Russian. This confused me even more. How come a work by a Russian I barely heard of, ever, and it still made such a devastating impact on me? I dismissed it as some weird, maybe unexplainable emotional outburst and just simply moved on. But now I know I should have trusted my instinct better. Forcefully Russified in a Russian language school and raised in Russified culture full of imperial lies, I grew up having zero idea that the real, non-Russified name of this artist was Kazimir Malevich. That he was not Russian, but a Ukrainian. That the running man, the picture you saw before it, was his coded cry of grief over the Moscow-committed artificial Holodomor genocide of the Ukrainian people in 1931-1933, the one that devastated my own family too. And that his legacy became a hostage to a much, much larger cultural appropriation heist committed by Russia. Malevich was born to a Ukrainian Polish family within the borders of the Russian Empire, but he never actually identified as anything but a Ukrainian. His art was soaked in the Ukrainianness and Ukrainian ancient art tradition, especially from the countryside. So for example, take a look at these satellite pictures already of our days of the farming fields in the southern Ukrainian region where I actually grew up. And it is now unfortunately temporarily stolen by Russia. And now, let me just juxtapose it to this Malevich's Peasants from 1932, also the Holodomor era, and his earlier Suprematism from 1915. So I'm now pretty sure, right, that that's exactly why his work made me so moved that day. Facing increasing persecution by Moscow for his growing anti-colonial resistance, Malevich arranged for most of his art collection to be shipped abroad in the late 1920s. So while being hailed as this modern art superstar outside the empire, he died trapped inside the empire from ill health inflicted by persecution and torture in 1935. So once silenced, Russia appropriated Malevich's outside impact on global culture as Russian. Together with the Ukrainian newsroom Shotam, we featured this story in this beautiful visual for the Voля Hub storytelling movement. However, Malevich was not the only indigenous talent whose legacy was stolen by Russia. So look at this picture here. It's 1922. It's from Belarusian city Vitebsk, and it features some of the artists from Unovis. It was a local avant-garde collective headed by Malevich, which will revolutionize their art world in the following decade. There are just 2 Russians in this picture, yet today this entire generation of Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish avant-garde artists are mostly known abroad as Russian, thanks to a Russian propaganda effort. Artists like, for example, Ukrainian's Alexandra Ekster. She was a trailblazer of Kubo-futurism, and her work stood aside as unusually bold in using contrast colors. Ekster's coloristic and decorative richness took root also in her infatuation with the ancient Ukrainian folk art. She had to flee Ukraine, running away from Russian tyrannical occupation of the First Ukrainian Republic in 1920s. Russia claims her as Russian. Or Jewish Belarusians like Mark Chagall. His work here, The Ukrainian Family from 1943, tells a story of the violence conspired and committed by colonial conquests of German Nazis and Russian Soviets during the World War II. that devastated Ukraine and Belarus and killed millions, actually 10% of Ukraine's population and every fourth Belarusian. And this painting is unfortunately as relevant today as it was in 1943. Considered the greatest Jewish painter who ever lived, Chagall's art has always been sensitive to imperial and colonial violence. He personally survived. Chagall had to flee Russian imperial occupation in the 1920s, and he never saw his home again. Russia claims Chagall as also Russian. Or Jewish Belarusian artist born in Latvia, Ilya Chashnik. A red circle on the black surface is from 1922, although you can see there's some spacecraft there, but it wasn't the intention at the first. And he was one of the most prominent students of Kazimir Malevich, most famous for his bold, futuristic mix of themes inspired by the interlocked dynamic of nature and cosmos. And similarly to Malevich, his minimalist approach of two colors was inspired by ancient graphic art of Ukrainians and Belarusians. Sotheby's sold one of his works in 2016 for $3 million and labeled Chashnik as Russian. So this cultural appropriation campaign is also not that old and happened barely 30 years ago. When the Soviet era of Russian imperialism collapsed in disgrace in the 1990s, Moscow desperately needed a PR damage control to revitalize its tarnished civilizational greatness image. In the tactic tested and deployed in endless numbers of time throughout Russian imperial history, the legacy of these Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish avant-garde legends became an easy appropriation play. So here's a quote from an amazing long read by an Estonian journalist, Eero Epner. And she says that Ukrainian avant-garde from the 1910s and 1920s was a splendid period in the art history of the world, which was imitated, copied, and used as a role model from Paris to Berlin, but only nobody knew that it was all made in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Lviv. They thought that it was the world-famous Russian avant-garde, made by Russians in ancient Russian territories in accordance with Russian tastes. During the Soviet era, appropriation occurred through killing, prohibiting, destroying, and hiding Ukrainian artists in their art. Then in the 1990s, Moscow quickly understood that culture always equals politics. So the taps were turned on and large exhibitions were organized in Europe. Catalogs were published and grants were generously handed out to researchers from Russia and abroad. And this led to this understanding that avant-garde contained certain axes. Moscow, Berlin, or Moscow, Paris. But Kiev, well, you know, they have baked pies. So the Russian avant-garde brand was skillfully established in the world art market, which is one of the main creators of cultural memory. So this Russian colonial heist is not limited to indigenous cultures either. Some short time after that museum incident that I shared earlier, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and the Russian theft of Ukrainian identity went absolutely supernova. In early 2015, Russians installed this ginormous 25-meter tall monument to Volodymyr the Great in downtown Moscow, claiming that this Kiev ruler from the 10th century created a single Russian nation. The fact that this pagan Ukrainian prince lived several centuries before Kiev Rus founded Moscow as a borderland colonial outpost on the outskirts of Europe would absolutely not matter to Russian imperial propaganda. It defaulted to its primary appropriation mode to rally public support for another colonial war, to claim the status of a great empire. You need great history, and Russia is too young of an empire to have one. That's why stealing the ancient history of the closest neighbor became the Moscow's coping strategy.
What is now known as Russian history and what is generously served by Mr. Putin to Tucker Carlson and all the other gullible Westerners as the one and only version of the sacred history of Mother Russia, millennium old history, and so on and so forth. Well, it's all been written in 1674 in Kiev by one of our Baroque thinkers of the time, Innocentii Hizel. And on the whole, Russian Empire appeared as a brainchild of Kiev intellectuals who had been working for nearly a century on the concept of an Orthodox empire. We, Ukraine.
So this is a quote by prominent Ukrainian thinker and writer Dr. Oksana Zabushko for Volia Hub's Matryoshka of Lies audio show. It highlights a still little-known fact abroad that the mythology excusing Russian civilizational mission was actually written by Ukrainian intellectuals in 17th century, after Russia colonized Ukraine for the first time. So then a relatively young state desperately needed a PR story to move away from Muscovy to Russia, presenting itself as ancient, as an excuse for imperial expansion. They stole Ukraine's original name, Rus, and newly conquered Ukrainians helped to shape that myth of Russian civilizational superiority. Ukrainians like Theophan Prokopovich and Alexander Bezborodko, for example. So a former colony of Kiev that colonized its former metropole and stole its history to craft its own imperial supremacy myth. Honestly, this aspect of Russian colonialism is one of the thickest to drill through, but it's also not impossible to get. Ukrainian filmmaker Alexei Radinsky was the first person to help me to drill through this in a very digestible way. So here's a quote from our chat with him for the Ukrainian Spaces show, also part of the Volia Hub constellation.
To start with, contemporary Ukraine and contemporary Russia do not have a very long shared history, right? Their shared history dates back to just 350 years or something like that. But in this essay, I've been trying to deconstruct the myths, that actually link the history of contemporary Russia and contemporary Ukraine to this kind of semi-mythical medieval entity referred to as Kiev and Rus, the Kievska Rus, that is kind of a foundational myth of kind of both contemporary Russia and contemporary Ukraine. So I think that unfortunately, like these days, we're still going to live under the spell of this kind of historical mythical thinking. So one productive way to move forward would be to subvert those myths and reclaim them maybe for the sake of the colonial struggle. So the foundational myth of Russian Federation says basically that Kiev is the mother of Russian cities, right? That because Kiev was the capital of this semi-mythical medieval state, before Moscow even was founded, then it kind of allows them to lay claim on Kiev as a city that has to be reoccupied and reconnected to Russia. But if you take this myth really seriously, in a way, then it's clear that what we now refer to as the Russian Federation, or basically every iteration of the Russian state, could be seen as a kind of a bastard of this really unfortunate colonial process of the eastward expansion of Eastern Slavs.
So this appropriation heist by colonial Russia is not a chapter from history. It keeps happening. While Russia murders Ukrainian artists and thinkers, Russian colonial authorities ban kolyatki in the occupied territories. This is an ancient Ukrainian tradition of Christmas caroling that dates back to our pagan times. Simultaneously, Russian TikTok influencers were promoting something that they called kolyada in Moscow, using stolen images of Ukrainian carol singers and appropriating this tradition. So not only Russians be stealing, falling victims to generations of Russian imperial propaganda, foreigners often help in erasing the indigenous identities of our artists. This video is promotional by the New York Ballet from last year, heavily referenced Ukrainian filmmakers such as Serhiy Sarkis-Parajanov without crediting him, as well as Chagall and Madame Karinska without ever mentioning their respective Jewish, Belarusian, and Ukrainian roots. All of this was repackaged as a celebration of Russian visual aesthetics, considering that Russians sent Parajanov to a concentration camp for being unapologetically Ukrainian and queer, and that they keep doing the same with Ukrainian artists today, this visual checked absolutely all the boxes of obscene colonial appropriation, only this time it was done by a wealthy Western institution. Have you heard about any of these names I shared with you today? And if yes, did you know that they weren't actually Russian? And if you did not know, ask yourself why. Moscow doesn't just invade, it erases and exterminates. It steals our stories, our creations. This is one of my favorite Ukrainian pictures of all time. Snapped in 1925, it shows the young rebels of Olanka, a modernist literary crew that radiated brilliance. Just look at them, they look so, so cool. Unfortunately, it's also a story about a future they were never allowed to live, because within a decade, the Russian occupation machine erased all of them. 3 executed, 2 were sent to slave camps, and 1 silenced into oblivion. Before every story and project I launched at Volya Hub, I actually take a moment to look at this picture. Because it reminds me what it's at stake, that it hasn't started during my lifetime, that we're not dealing with a normal country having a bad decade, instead with an empire having just a typical century. Russia isn't just an adversary or regional threat. It's a 500-year-old imperial project that's been perfecting the art of expansion, absorption, and erasure since before most European states even existed. So we're at war with the world's oldest surviving empire, and the war and expansion, it is the only way for that empire to survive. And these are just the picture from this morning of the attacks on Ukrainian cities in Kharkiv and Kherson. And once Russian empire succeeds at invading, occupying, and exterminating, the scorched space left behind gets flooded with great Russian culture. Because when you silence people's stories, it becomes easier to erase their otherness, easier to convince them they're too small, too primitive, too broken to rule themselves. That's why we must educate about, share, and celebrate indigenous voices in our storytelling, especially those silenced or appropriated and stolen by Russian colonial terror. So it's our daily reality in 2025, and the only reason why this obscene injustice is still being perpetrated in broad light is because we have been failing to call out this colonial abuse for way too long. I will end tonight with a quote from Victoria Amelina, a Ukrainian writer murdered by Russian invaders in 2023. Russian manuscripts don't burn. That might be true, but Ukrainians can only laugh bitterly. It's imperial manuscripts that don't burn, ours do. They're burning now, while the world debates whether it should forgive Russian imperial art and literature. So support Ukrainian wartime journalism, art, and publishing, and please share our award-winning guidebook, Russian Colonialism 101. Last week, it got out in German as well, and it's available to buy in German in Germany. And Volya Hub doesn't receive any institutional funding for these lectures, so we run this entirely as a volunteer effort. So if our mission inspires you and you vibe with it, please spread the word, but above all, join the daily call to arm Ukrainian anti-colonial resistance and ensure that our European democracies stand a chance in the face of this rising tide of imperialism. And many thanks today for inviting us, and I think for now we also will have a lovely conversation on the stage, and also please join with your questions as well. Thank you so much.
Einmal ganz kurz, ich habe was vergessen zu sagen, bevor wir auf die Bühne kommen. Vorhin haben wir vergessen, nochmal hier direkt darauf hinzuweisen, dass es eine direkte Übersetzung Deutsch-Englisch gibt. Wenn jemand von euch ein Gerät braucht, was jetzt vom Deutschen ins Englische oder umgekehrt funktioniert, ich würde es holen. Braucht jemand eine Übersetzung? Ins Englische, okay. Gut, auf jeden Fall trotzdem hier an dieser Stelle an Claire und Mimi, die unsere Übersetzung machen, einen Applaus bitte.
So I think we planned speaking English, so this we will do. We will be speaking English, and if you need German headphones, falls ihr Kopfhörer braucht, wurde schon hingewiesen. Wir können eine Sekunde warten. You need headphones? Okay, great. So I will start with introducing myself. I'm Kateryna Rietz-Rakul, and I'm head of the Ukrainian Institute. We are in Germany. We are based in Berlin. Happy to be here in the windy Hamburg. On my right, Professor Dr. Annette Werberger. She holds the chair of Eastern European Literature at the Faculty of Cultural Studies in Viadrina, the European University Viadrina. And our narrator, who narrated the lecture previously, Maksym Eristavi, from the author of the Russian Colonialism 101 book, which we actually presented in Frankfurt just last week. It is available in the bookshops and to order. And a very easy reading, actually, which is a little dictionary of colonialism, good for everybody who starts out on this journey, and good for everybody who needs a cheat to look up the information. I want to start with asking you, Annette, about your reaction to the lecture we just saw.
Yeah, first of all, I want to give my compliments. Great lecture, and I knew nearly every writer and every artist you presented there also. And maybe I could add a little bit about why was it so important for the Soviet Union and also for the Russian Federation now to claim this artist. You could say maybe it's a kind of elitist thing. If there's in a museum, there's some Russian author or Ukrainian painter. Why is it so important? And I'm doing since maybe 35 years Slavic studies and Eastern European history and everything. And I know that the avant-garde is a very, very important topic. If I'm making I made a seminar on avant-garde or on realism, for example. A lot of people will arrive because a kind of brand of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. So I want to maybe stress there's a connection. There seems to be a connection between avant-garde, nation, and modernity, and that's the reason why it's so a field which is a fighting field, you could say. And we have this kind of cultural imaginary about Europe. And maybe we don't know even about it, but we have this imagination that important nations have an avant-garde. Other nations don't have an avant-garde. And it's come out from the 19th century, from our DNA about what is a nation, what is modernization, and everything like that. And maybe you remember also some kind of picture from the Soviet Union, a kind of tableau of the people of the Soviet Union. And the Russian is always in a modern jacket, and all the others in this picture of international friendship, oder Völkerfreundschaft, as we say in German, have folkloristic things.
And not only that, but the Russian person is the whitest possible shade of skin, and the rest is just this gradient of other, which is...
Yeah, you're right. Bota would also, you quoted her, and she's, I learned a lot also with her about Kazakh history. And so, the Russian is the one who is forming statehood. And it's until now in the constitution of the Russian Federation that the Russian people are the state-forming nation. And so it's very strange for us because we don't have this imagination that there is a people who has a state-forming DNA or power. And it comes out of the 19th century when someone like Hegel or someone like Engels or Marx are speaking about nations with consciousness and revolutionary potential, and I could quote, there are a lot of articles, and nations without history, without consciousness, and not the ability to make a state. So you have this kind of big nations. For Marx, for example, it was Poland and Russia, and the other Slavs were all, you could say, not possible, counter-revolutionary in everything. And so it's very important that this kind of state forming, this kind of power you have as a nation shows somewhere. And the avant-garde is the peak of modernity, you could say. So the cosmism, the skyscrapers, the futurism, the program of the future, even today there's people like Thiel who quoting Russian avant-garde because they wanted to overcome death, for example, or something like that. And that's a very powerful tool for modernism, and to show we are the modern nation in the Central Eastern Europe, and all the others we educate. We make them modern slowly, but we have to Russify them. We have to give our language to them, because with Ukrainian, with Kazakh, you can't be a modern nation. So we educate, and you can hear it until now with Russian nationalists. Until now they say, so we educated the Kazakhs, we educated all these people, and they're against us now. We're so innocent, we helped, we wanted to give the good things. And I want to stress this, why also in Germany it's very, very, very popular to speak about Russian avant-garde, and maybe I will stop here. We can make it for then others.
I mean, it's not only Russian nationalists who say that. I heard it from many different people. We know it also from sometimes apologetic British people who said, but we didn't only bring grief, we also brought civilization to India, and the same is what Russians say. Like, to me also, we built your schools, we built your universities. But would you like to comment on what Anna said?
No, I think it's perfect. Yeah, they built the schools and civilized us, and unfortunately half of Ukrainians had to die in the process, but that's probably the price for civilization and other genocide that committed. And this is something that is never mentioned whatsoever, like the price that Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Estonians, all those nations had to pay for this being civilized.
I must say, I find it every time mind-blowing, and I again found it mind-blowing this time, to remember that Russian universities and Russian academic thought was established by scholars from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy from Ukraine, and I'm thinking about them like, why the fuck didn't you channel your energy into something better than the Russian imperial project?
That's actually a great point. I didn't know that until like really late, because once again, the part of the imperial playbook is to erase the evidence, rewrite the history, be in control of the story, be in control of history. So it wasn't that easily available at first. But when I started learning at first, my reaction was absolutely the same. Like, why did they do it? Because the kind of the imperial ideology that they planted there was really disregarding and really hurtful to themselves, and they had to, pass as a Russian or Russify themselves. But then you also start understanding, watching now, the occupation happening and all those very hard choices that people need to make in the occupation just to simply survive. And if you are inside the empire, of course, if you don't see any way to resist, you have to accommodate and you have to make some calls just to simply be and survive, or, to have any normal life, or, advance. Like, I always remember my parents who wanted to get a higher education, and lots of people don't know that at all, that during the Soviet times, during the Russian occupation of Ukraine, you couldn't have master's or PhD defended if it's not in Russian language. So if you come from Ukrainian background, when it comes to high science, your language, indigenous language, won't work. You need to do it in Russian. Therefore, they had to study and learn Russian and pass as Russian. You cannot do it in broken Russian. You have to sound Russian. and so on, so on. So these are very tough choices that people made during that. But also this is important history to see how, empire, their main driving force is to extract resources. And doesn't matter if it's, actual physical resources on territories, mining and everything which empires do, but also extract human resources. And this way Russia needed these resources and they just extracted. And then in Russian history now, those are great Russians that came up with great ideas how great Russia is. And this is how this narrative myth lives on.
Going on this path, but being in Germany, I have lived here since more than 20 years. I understand that every time we talk about decolonialism, imperialism, etc., this couple of Russia and Ukraine does not pop up in the minds of people usually. Recently, more so, especially in light of this neo-colonial war going on now. What is your argument, first maybe to Maksym, why is Ukraine, why are we allowed to, and why should we speak of Ukraine in this context?
I honestly, of course, since I communicate with people abroad in English, so I try to find these anchor words that would probably make this bridge easier to explain personally what I went through, what my parents, grandparents, generations of Ukrainians went through, to similar experiences that people have elsewhere in the world, because that's how I learned that I'm not the only one, even within my own family. And I think, of course, in different cultures, these terms have different loaded meanings, especially such heavy terms as colonialism and decolonization. But I feel like it's important to start always with those human stories and very intimate experiences that you describe. And then, people can reconnect. That's when I started traveling abroad and started actually hearing stories, sharing my own stories or stories of my people. I found out surprising connections. Like, for example, when it comes to one of the features of what it means to be colonized is the losing your own identity or not being able to find your way back to authentic selves, because whatever you thought that you are is usually lies and based on propaganda and myths. So I was brought up in a Ukrainian-speaking family speaking Russian. So nobody around me spoke Russian. Everybody spoke with each other Ukrainian, but I was brought up speaking Russian. And for a long time, I had like zero idea why, because it's so, especially for a child, so paradoxical, why you're not allowed to connect with your parents in the most intimate way through language. And only with time, comparing other kids from my generation, being raised in southern and eastern Ukraine, lots of families had the same situation, because that wasn't a natural choice. That was a choice of survival for parents, because they want their kids to succeed, maybe to pass as Russian if they look, Russian enough, weight enough. But also that was their coping mechanism. We will teach him Russian, he will never speak Ukrainian, or he will never have an accent. And when I was already studying at school during independence years, mind you, in Ukraine, it was a Russian language school, and we had Ukrainian language and Ukrainian literature as separate objects, and the entire program was in Russian. And I remember that other teachers in our school, Ukrainian teachers, bullied Ukrainian language teacher if she dares to assign a low grade for students, because they would tell them, this is not a real subject. This is not a real thing that you can mess up the grades for the students. And all of it is very personal experience or stories that kind of show you this pattern that in different languages might have different meanings, different words. And I didn't learn what it called academically until later. But I think in the nutshell, at the bottom of it, this experience of losing your identity, or having really hard time reconnecting with your own story, is a hallmark and feature of what it means to be colonized, or surviving colonization.
Yeah, I think I would like Annette to ask you for a reaction, but I first react myself because when I these first words of the lecture, that I was disconnected from my heritage, I also learned to despise it, and for me, that was what happened to me. I did despise. I thought of myself as a Russian, and I'm, by the way, from Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine is always put in not only in propaganda discourse, but the mainstream German discourse as something very Ukrainian, where everybody is Ukrainian and speaking Ukrainian. But no, it's not true. It's Ukraine is diverse throughout the huge country. And there are people like me brought up in Western Ukraine speaking Russian in a family where none of my family members is Russian. They come from different corners of Ukraine and Europe. But that was the survival mechanism, because they all gathered together, all from colonized people, Moldova, Ukrainians, Jews, Poles, and Moldovians of, again, different origins, and then decided, after the Second World War, they all decided our main goal is to survive. It's not to have any identity, and to survive and be successful, you had to become a Russian. So they chose a name from all of them, which was kinda, sorta not crazy. It was still not very Russian, but it was okay. It was Rakul. It was a name when nobody understood where it's from. At least it's better than being a Ukrainian or Jewish or Polish. And that's how we grew up. And my only impulse to come back to my roots was 2014, when I thought, it can't be, that it can't be, it's not all of it. And then I started poking around, and then I switched with my child, I switched to Ukrainian in 2014, because I thought, like, this colonial, and this is how I explained it also to my husband and to my family, colonial history of our family will end with me. My child will not be a product of colonial history. And yeah, it is was like a big process for me, because I work with languages. I'm an interpreter. Languages are my world, and then one of those languages became unbearable for me to speak and to hear. I haven't spoken a word of Russian since years. So yeah, and my parents also switched with my daughter, and then with me, and then with each other into Ukrainian. So yeah, it could have been a therapy, you know, this is our topic, and this was now all of a sudden I had the therapy here, 10 minutes of my personal therapy. But Annette, you, from your scholarly and your German perspective, how would you comment on the Ukrainian phenomena in the framework of decolonial studies?
Yeah, when you both told your story, I was remembered of a meeting about decolonization in Belarus and Ukraine. I told you about it. It was in Lithuania maybe 2 years ago. It was in Belarusian and it was in Ukrainian, so it was a challenge also for me to understand what is going on. And it was there that Vasily Czarnecki brought up, for example, the book Decolonizing the Mind. It's very popular, I think, between people who are occupied with decolonialism. And he's telling the story similar to you, that he was brought up with English. And if to be a good pupil, a good student, you have to have a perfect English. And so his home language, I'm not sure it's what it was. I can't remember now. It's a shame that I can't remember the African language. It wasn't Woflo, it wasn't Swahili, from Vitongo. And he told this story, how he grew out of this English oppression, you could say, and how he found his own language at the end. And this whole story he told in 83 or 84 is the book. And it was very powerful for Ukrainians to read this story of this African Kenya Nobel Prize writer, Ntongo, and to hear this kind of story and to make comparisons and differences also. And then maybe I want to add 2 or 3 things why we don't understand. When the Great War began, a lot of people asked me all the time, is Ukrainian really a language? So it was, is it not like a dialect? Is it not a kind of dialect? And why is everybody saying it's a language? There's no literature, there's nothing. And I had to explain all the time this kind of thing. And I think there's really a lack of understanding what the Soviet Union was and what the empire was. So we don't understand this kind of situation anymore in Germany, or we didn't understand it. This kind of oppression, this kind of Russification. So we had 3 European empires, the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, you could also say the Ottoman Empire, the empire with the center in Istanbul, and then came up in 1922 the Soviet Empire. But I think we have lost the connection what an empire, how our empire is working, and a lot of Germans are thinking all the time, so this kind of Soviet Union was a good empire. It was a good empire. It was Völkerfreundschaft. Everybody was friends with each other. Russian and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy was a kind of present to everybody, developing and so people couldn't understand what is happening. Why now Ukrainians say no? It's oppression, everything, and this kind of multiculturalism myth was very powerful, and it's very in also my own scientific community. Very powerful. You can make a critique of nation state, rightfully. If the nation state is only ethnically, it's not good to have this kind of nation state. You have to have a political nation state where everybody can join, yes. But the empire wasn't criticized, and also the structures weren't understood. How oppression, how Russification is working, how genocide is working with the Holodomor. And then a second problem, maybe I may add, I think when we think about decolonizing the mind or decolonizing culture, we think about the global south. It was before the third world. And then we have the first world, the global north. And then the second world somehow vanished. It's like the second world, so the Warsaw Bloc vanished from our also notions. We don't have even a notion about it. It's somehow Central Eastern Europe or something. But in my time, we had this kind of first world, second world, third world. And the second world, what happened? I'm also always quoting Habermas, who said in 1889 or 90, so now Eastern Europe has to join us in our contemporary modernity. It's belated, it's late, it has to modernize itself. So somehow the second world is now a kind of part of the first world, but it isn't. And I think I don't want to it's not a kind of exotism, I want to say. So every Ukrainian and Pole and Czech is different from us. That's not, but they have a kind of different experience of history, language, culture, and nobody wanted to hear it, I think. It's like, yeah, do something, join us, but all these problems, all this changing frontiers and borders and languages, it's so complicated. And Georgian is not a Slavic language, really? You can't translate it and everything. And I think that's a very important thing, that this vanishing second world, it was too fast. Everybody said, yeah, the Cold War is over. Now it's another world, and yeah, that's. I wanted to stress this point.
Maybe you guys also have any questions. So we would love to bring you in if you have one. We're happy to start answering. Any questions? I have something I remembered, and as a recommendation, there's a fantastic Ukrainian researcher of imperialism, Maryam Nayem, and there are a couple of her books that are getting out, but her focus was and is on popular culture. And she looks into popular culture of recent several decades, specifically what in Russia was produced or in Ukraine produced, and she looks in these very popular in Ukraine popular culture characters. Like, for example, what was the show about the nanny? The English language show Nanny from 80s, 90s. It was franchised in Russia, and in that show they didn't change much, but this character of Nanny is actually Ukrainian. And the show was quite recently, like late 90s, early 2000s. It was super popular everywhere in Ukraine in Russian language. But this nanny is presented as this low-educated, she cannot put her words together, and she's like, silly, and she's funny, and she cooks well, but she's also not that serious, and of course she's not very intellectual. But everyone, the life is, the show is happening in Moscow, so they're like Russians who are much more educated, and they're always, lovingly but patronizingly. And she always reminds that, first of all, that it's still happening in popular culture, and you just don't know the language, you don't know this context, but it's out there, vast amount of such content there. But second of all, yes, they allowed us to be within the empire, but with a role that they assigned for you to be. So you can be like, singing your silly songs unless they're political. You can wear your silly clothes unless it's made cheaply from like some artificial fabric. And you can have your foods and cuisine, whatever, but don't you dare to ever, cross that place where they assigned you to be, that you're in any way cultured, or you have ancient culture, language, or you're proud of it, that you're not a little brother or sister, but you're equal. And this is a dynamic that everybody in the empire, in Russian Empire, former or current, they know very well, and they instantly can recognize in conversation with a Russian. But unfortunately abroad, this is barely touched upon. So do look up Maryam's work. She's also fantastic on this specific as well.
And her comic book on Ukrainian history is also out now in German. This is also from Nayem, a comic book on Ukrainian history. You can buy it now. And but I just wanted to say that food, actually, no. The vast majority of Ukrainian food is lost to us. There is another movement happening now in Ukraine, rediscovering Ukrainian national dishes, because we have only couple which were allowed and also assimilated into Russian, borscht and vareniki. Other than that, whole Soviet Empire cuisine was boiled potatoes, boiled carrots, boiled eggs mixed with mayonnaise in different proportions. No, that was the festive table in the Soviet Union. And but the national, and then they had several Georgian dishes which they tried to assimilate into also Russian Soviet cuisine, and that's it. And now there's the whole what Yevhen Klopotenko is doing, with the restoring Ukrainian recipes.
Or Oля Hercules,
yes,
who's also amazing in this. Just one quick story, because I remember cuisine. Okay, yeah, they allowed some of cuisine, but one of the because in my book I try to expose people to serial behavior of Russian invasions and what they specifically do, a checklist, what they do when they invade. And erasure, part of it, like not only raising people, but also raising their homes, their cities, their belongings. So one of the things that regularly happened when Russian invasion, would happen, for example, in villages, it happened to my village as well in 2022. They would ask, or when they raid the houses, they would take away not only Ukrainian language books, but also cookbooks. Because in Ukrainian tradition, you know, they were usually handwritten, and women would put a lot of additional information in there because it was kind of like semi-safe space where you can escape censorship and put something, maybe some poetry or maybe some facts about your family or something like that. And usually nobody would look into these silly cookbooks. But with time, they realized that this is also a form kind of personal resistance. So what they often do, they ask either to bring those cookbooks or they burn them on the spot as well. And when I saw that happening, well, not saw, but when I heard that it was happening in my village in 2022, I was shocked because it was so paradoxical for me at first. But then I started reading stories from, you know, Ukraine back and other parts of that would share the same thing, that they also targeted their cookbooks. So you're right, there was allowed something that you could cook, but God forbid it just feeds into image that you're a legit, ancient, valid culture that has its own traditions.
I mean, that's, the burning the books part reminded me of the question I had to both of you. I think because it's every time I tell here in Germany that as soon as Russians enter a village or a city, they burn Ukrainian books. It is unfathomable sometimes for my German friends and colleagues to understand that not only Germans have the monopoly of burning books. It's like, no, Russians are burning books. No, you sure? I said, like, here's a video, just Google it. But the connection of how can German people in Germany understand us better, us in this case Ukrainians, but also as representatives of former Second World, let's say. The question is, in your book, Maksym, there is also a chapter on Germany, on your book of Colonization 101. I always point there, but there is no picture of the book. And but this chapter is terribly short. And I would go, as we have a German person here, I will also ask you to comment, but I will first go to Annette. What do you think about Germany in this framework of decolonial narration from the point of view of Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I think already I thought about Germany already in 2014 when I had some fighting with friends over the question that Putin is a leftist or something, so I even can't understand anymore that this former friend thought like that. And since 2022, I am thinking much more about what is the special relation of Germany with Russia we are struggling with, and this is the perspective on Ukraine. It's not only a German problem, it's also somehow, for example, an Italian problem and from other things, but okay, let's stick to Germany. And I don't know if I have an answer, but sometimes I have the imagination. And I have to say, a lot of people are understanding now the situation. I think a lot of changed. I have a lot of people who are very interested, very supportive in many ways to Ukraine, actually. But I also thought at the beginning, why can Germans as former perpetrators so very well understand the contemporary perpetrators, the Russians? Why do they understand the Russians more than the victims? And Germany, 2 times occupied, everybody knows it already, I think, 2 times occupied in the 20th century Ukraine, also other parts. For Poland, you could say 6 years. And the occupation, I think, is a big lag in our memory. That's why it's so important to have a museum of occupation, the whole of the German occupation in Europe in general, but especially I think in Central and Eastern Europe, because most Germans think about the Holocaust, and it's good that they think about the Holocaust, but it's also the Holocaust by bullets, which was different in Central and Eastern Europe, and it was this, you told it, 10% of the Ukrainians died, 1/4 of the Belarusians died in the war. And we don't remember that. We don't know enough about the villages which were burned, for example, in Belarus or also in Ukraine. I looked them up at the beginning and I thought, we don't have enough books about it. It's really, so we don't know enough about the occupation because maybe a lot of grandfathers were there. And so it's better to forget, maybe, okay, with regard to the extermination of the Jewish population in Central Eastern Europe, we have learned something, but about the Slavic population, and especially about Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine, we don't know enough, also Lithuanian. And so that's a big thing, the occupation, I think. If people hear the word occupation, they think about the occupation after the Second World War.
So you mean when we talk about Russian occupation of Ukraine, there is like, it's difficult to understand what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so you know, the Ukrainians always saying the Gauleiter, the Russian Gauleiter. When I heard it the first time, I was astonished, but okay, you can say, why shouldn't the Ukrainians not remember the German Gauleiters when they have a Russian Gauleiter? Okay, maybe not every German scholar is happy about this kind of choice of word, but I can understand that there are similarities. And the second thing, I always try, I'm now writing even, I told you, a small book about German-Russian relations with regard to why Germans and Russians in difficult times find always a kind of similarity, or I call it anagnorisis. They found something into the other which they want to take out. And it's always a bad time for the neighbors of Germany.
So they like identify with each other rather than with...
They see each other a similarity, you could say. And I think that Russia and Germany have somehow this imagination that in Europe they have a special mission, or the Germans thought they have a special mission. I tried to explain like this, that Germans and Russians and Germans, hopefully I can speak, they thought about it, they're not thinking anymore like that. They thought they have a special way to think, a special way to see culture. For example, the Germans with Nietzsche. We have the big, great German philosophy. The Russians have the great Russian literature, and so Dostoevsky and everything. And Dostoevsky and Nietzsche have also a similar function in this model. And when the French and the British, you could say, have the parliament, invented election and all this kind of things, then Germans thought, and Russians think until now, that's a kind of bourgeois way, a capitalistic way, a materialistic way. And these two cultures, Germany and Russian, they have a spiritual way of thinking about Europe. It's very striking for me if I'm reading things from the 20s and the 30s and reading Russian fascists today. There are a lot of similarities which are really...
Well, it's a fascist empire.
Yeah, it's a fascist empire. I'm totally with you. But it's, I'm saying fascists, people don't understand. That's why I try to a little bit show what it means.
Yeah, of course.
And people think they're giving goodness. It's a good thing that we think differently, because at the end, democracy and parliamentarism is bringing the worst thing to Europe. So I try to explain a little bit more. What does it mean to say fascist? Because then people understand it's not only a word.
Yeah.
So I can't go further, but maybe that's...
No, I think it's a valid point about the chapter that was short. But you talked about the Ukrainians and why Ukrainians call Russian occupiers with these German names, because indeed our families did survive, well, my family did survive both Russian occupation, reoccupation, German occupation. My grandma was a slave, kidnapped by Germans, and she worked 2 years as a slave building a road in Germany when she was 16. And so they do know both sides of this imperialism and know very well. And that's why I think now lots of Ukrainians are pushing a bit Germans to be more honest and more open about their own legacy, not only as, you know, those who were occupiers, or why they, for example, have so much, by default, sympathy towards Russian, but not so much sympathy to all those dozens of nations who are suffering from, or surviving, or did not survive Russian occupation, Russian colonization. And when I was writing this book, it's a guidebook on invasions per se. And you know, this feature of colonialism, what do they do, like practically? What do they do when they decide to invade? And they follow this specific formula. And I added Germany, not that much there, because that specific invasion in 1952 did follow all the same playbook. But you know, every day I keep educating myself and learn more about what Russia has done, and the extent of this misdeeds is horrifically long, so you cannot know for sure. And at the time, I didn't have any knowledge whatsoever, or even the capacity to study or educate myself on this. So I saw the pattern, I put there Germany. I knew for sure that I was trying to put something more that's gonna be too, like, controversial maybe. And I decided to, okay, if someday comes and there's gonna be German translation of this book, I will come to places like that and I will ask people, what do you think should be there? Because you know your history better. And if you guys, you know, want to contribute as Germans here, you can, I'm happy to hear. But in the last 2 years, when I started doing also newsletter around this, I started studying, and I come around some of the books about Russian occupation of Germany after World War II. And there are not enough research on it because it's complicated, and invasion of Germany happened completely for different reasons than ongoing invasion of Ukraine. But the playbook that Imperial Russian Army followed when it comes to violence, when it comes to murder, when it comes to abuse, it was absolutely the same playbook that they tried and tested before, and they're doing it now in Ukraine. When it comes to mass rape, when it comes to stealing kids, when it comes to you know, abusing the population, or mass murder as well. I was just writing an edition that I found out archive research about stolen German kids between 1945 and 1949 that were taken from Germany during the from this Russian side of occupation for re-education, and tens of thousands ended up in camps for re-education. The majority of them died there because of horrific conditions in the same camps that Germans built for Holocaust. And when I was reading those stories and testimonies, it was horrifically similar how they treat Ukrainian kids now, because part of the Russian imperial warfare is, you know, not only steal territory, but also latch on local kids and try to erase their identity, turn them into militarized asset, and so on and so on. So there's an entire checklist why they're doing it, and it's not random, and it's not just, you know, random evil. That's a warfare strategy. So they did that to Germany as well. And these kind of conversations, I think Ukrainians are comfortable to ask Germans to have, because we've been on the end of German occupation, Russian occupation, so we're not, you know, our families, we're not strangers to this. And we are honest about discussing what it meant to us, how it all was complex, but also very important. And I feel like Germans can have this conversation, should be having, because if you don't understand what is Russia, what is doing, that it's colonial war, that it's imperial war, that it's not Putin's war, that's not just, you know, some madman's plan, but it's strategy, a serial behavior, how can we possibly design any defense strategies? You know, Russian drones already swarming above our heads, and we have like zero idea how to respond, because we still do not understand why they're there and what's the purpose.
Yes, and you're right. And there are actually a lot of similarities, I think, where we can try to maybe start with these similarities and where we understand each other, and then go further and explore it, because I think it would be also very It would be a good medicine for the problems German society is facing now, with people splashing to extreme left and to extreme right. With extreme left, I mean Sarah Wagenknecht, because like I find personally, I find it very disturbing that there is no healthy left at the moment. There is no left party, democratic left party, actually having an agenda of helping people and having power to influence it, because, I don't know, it's not a topic, but SPD is not a party which is actually looking over interests of us working people. And, I also remembered, because also thinking of Germany and thinking of Ukraine, I realized that changing the family names is a thing, like Jewish population here having all these German names all of a sudden for some reason, and all these Ukrainian families having Russian names all of a sudden for some reason. Lots of my friends, like I have a girlfriend, my best friend, she's actually from a Cossack family, which, as she found out recently, Makucha, but they all go by Makuchina because they all made great career. And
I mean, they're Russified there.
Yes, there are a lot of Ukrainian names being Russified, a lot, ending over, in, and stuff, just to be more successful. So, I mean, also this is interesting where we can start. And I hope our German friends and colleagues and just people will allow themselves to look at themselves, at least in the eastern part, also as being colonized, and by Russia to a certain degree, where Russia applied force and changed this part of the country. And when you look at the maps of Germany, or different things like tennis courts, theaters, knowledge of foreign languages, traveling, whatever, there are these maps of Germany indicating different phenomena, and you still see the border between East and the West, still, after all these years. And this has a reason, no?
Can I share? Because I think we need to wrap up, but I have one story. When I first time came to Berlin, and that struck me, just these Soviet monuments of grandeur in Berlin connected to World War II. And of course, there's one for Liberator in the, what's the place called?
Brandenburger Tor, you mean?
Yeah, Treptow.
Oh, you mean Treptow? Because they're...
Yeah. So, I mean, these are kind of monuments. We have lots of places in, in the eastern part of, in Eastern Europe, in places where ruled by Russia. And we all know the nature of it, because for Russia, when they want to emphasize that they're liberators, it's Russians who liberated you. But when we talk about this, horrible legacy of Russian occupation with mass rapes and everything, oh, those are Soviets did it. Whoever those people were, not Russians. So they, code switch very often. But for them, this picture and this image of civilized or liberator is very important. So I looked up in the history how this thing, was constructed. It was striking for me that this was literally the first order when the imperial troops moved in Berlin to build that, and it was built out of rubble that they could find, because there was, everything was destroyed, and it was a higher priority, despite that people were dying of hunger, and people died also constructing it because they used the locals' labor. But for Russians, it was utmost priority to establish that monument that tells the story. And there's liberator with a child, with image that your kids, and you had something bad you did, and we came and fixed the situation. And once again, for me, it was obvious that that's exactly what they will do, because they built the same kind of shit everywhere in Eastern Europe, wherever we go, because it's important to mark your place, that we're liberators, we're civilizers. But I didn't know that this story behind German monument, and you're right that, you still see the effect of that occupation and the fact that it had on this part in a very different way. But once again, not German, happy to learn more. And just these are things that are very connect with me, with my own story, my understanding of my land, that I find interesting.
Yeah, maybe I'm not prepared now to speak about East and West Germany because, okay, I'm from European University, so I think it's also a problem in the East that we lost a lot of population, or I'm saying we, but I'm from the West, but I see it in Frankfurt-Oder, for example, that maybe before the peaceful revolution, there were nearly 100,000 people there, and now we are a little bit under 60,000 people. So it's different because there's a lack of a certain generation also. So it's I'm not a big fan of this kind of. I know in the journals there's always the time. Yeah, so there's the AfD, and there we have SPD and Greens and. Like that, because I'm living there also, or I'm working there, I see it a little bit more complex, and it's not so easy. And especially if you're looking in some cities like maybe Leipzig or in Berlin also, and in Potsdam, and so. But for sure, it's food for thought to think about it. But I know a lot of people, and we had also now the elections, and somehow. Nobody from the AfD got a mayorship in the town, so I was very happy about this situation. But yes, there's some struggle also about history, also about the history of the occupation of the Allies, and it's sometimes kidnapped also by the radical parties, especially by the AfD, and so it's another theme. But I think what is important once again about, for example, for Germans to understand, especially for Germans from the West, is the different look on the Second World War. And I want to quote what Yermolenko a month ago in the literary festival for Victoria Amelina, the Ukrainian philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko, and it was his first speech in German. And I was there also because I met also Victoria Amelina in 2023 in the Pilecki Institute. And one phrase I think was very important for a German audience, for example, and I think for both, for Germans who grew up in maybe my generation, there's still a divide. Afterwards, it's still not so much, but they say, he said the Soviet Union was one of the states that started the Second World War. Yeah, we don't remember it very well. In the 17th of September 1939, the Red Army occupied, for example, your hometown, Lviv. But unlike Nazi Germany, it did not lose it. So the Soviet Union did win the war at the end. For the Western world, 1945 was the victory of the good over the evil, and everybody would say it here in Germany, I think. For us, said the Ukrainian philosopher, it was the victory of the evil over another evil. So the evil remained. And I know Germans are very, I think, for me also, this speech about das Böse, the evil, is a little bit strange if you're speaking about it in 25, but Ukrainians are so often speaking about it, the evil, that I thought, okay, you have to, it's a challenge. You have to admit there is this evil which Ukrainians are dealing with, and they're thinking that the occupation, the Soviet occupation, was an evil, and it remained. And it's not a good empire. It was easier for Western world to think about this as a kind of, okay, maybe Stalin, he was against the Nazis, so at the end he wasn't so bad. Maybe, okay, there was 37 and there was the gulags. But the gulags were not the concentration camps. Also the gulags, somehow, maybe it's not so bad like the concentration camps. So I'm quoting, hopefully everybody will understand. And you have this kind of view. For example, I'm not sure how many people here in the room read something about Auschwitz. Maybe Celan. But how many of you read something about the Gulag? Maybe a novel, maybe an autobiography. And I like, for example, a book on Barbara Skarga, who was for 10 years a Polish scholar. I'm reading a lot of Polish and Czech and Slovak authors. And she thought about like thinking after the Gulag. And I think we didn't think after the Gulag. We thought about what it means, and that's important. What does it mean living, thinking, writing after Auschwitz? But we didn't think after what it means after the Gulag. And we don't have to compare. It's not in the sense that it's the same. I don't want to say it's the same, but we have a lack of reflection on it. And this is an experience, existential experience. A lot of people, a lot of families in Central and Eastern Europe have. And we look at it like, okay, it happened. But it's maybe not worth to think so much about it. And I think there is a lot of things we have to remember and we have to work on to understand better the situation and maybe also the political situation somehow. Yeah, the struggle between perpetrators and victims in one country, because the Soviet Union wasn't interested in the difference between the perpetrators and everything. So it's only everybody was a victim or nobody was a perpetrator.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you for listening. We have to wrap up. I know there is more festival program going on in the city, so thank you for coming. And we didn't get any questions from the crowd. I'm very sorry for that. But we are still here. You can ask us.
Thank you, Maksym Eristavi. Thank you, Annette Werberger. Thank you, Kateryna Rietz-Rakul, for the moderation and for this incredible talk. Learned so much. I hope everybody else agrees, and I'm sure about it. Ich gehe nochmal wieder zurück ins Deutsche. Vielen Dank, dass Sie alle hier waren, dass ihr alle heute hier wart beim ersten Tag von der Konferenz Tilting Structures im Rahmen des Fluctoplasma Festivals. Und morgen geht es hier weiter, und zwar ab 11 Uhr mit einer Keynote zum neu in Köln entstehenden Migrationsmuseum, Museum Selma, und danach eine Diskussion genau zum Thema neue Museen. Was gibt es an Entwicklungen von Museen, die sich nach außen öffnen? Welche Fallstricke gibt es? Und es wird auf jeden Fall auch morgen wieder ein sehr, sehr, sehr volles Programm, ein sehr, sehr, sehr spannendes Programm. Und wir freuen uns, wenn Sie alle wieder hier sind. Und ich möchte einmal noch Danke sagen an alle Leute, die heute hier Technik gemacht haben. Einen Applaus bitte. An alle Leute, die übersetzt haben, an alle, die diesen ersten Tag so fantastisch organisiert haben und die gesamte Konferenz auf die Beine gestellt haben. Das ist eine ganz, ganz große Leistung. Vielen, vielen Dank dafür. Vielen Dank, dass Sie heute hier waren, und wir sehen uns hoffentlich morgen.